Our next reading this morning comes from the book of Genesis out of the 16th chapter. I'll be reading the beginning at the first verse, and I would invite you to listen for the word of God. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." And Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said to her, "Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will also greatly multiply your offspring, that they cannot be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all of his kin." So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi," for she said, "I have really seen God and remained alive after seeing him." Therefore the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abram a son. And Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. The grass withers and the flowers fade, but this, the word of the Lord, will endure forever. Thanks be to God. Amen. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be found acceptable to you, O God, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A parable. A man decides to seek his fortune by searching for gold out in the mountains of the west. So he takes all the money that he has, he invests in a claim and makes a stake on a claim, a certain area where he can prospect. He goes out and buys all the necessary equipment, and he walks out there into the mountainsides of the west to his claim, and he digs and he searches and he scratches, he sifts. Every once in a while he'll find a little bit of gold, but certainly not enough gold to justify his desire to find what is called the mother lode of all lodes, to find that vein of gold that will make him wealthy. He searches and searches. He digs and he digs. He finds little bits of gold, but he never finds what he's looking for, and after a while he just gets discouraged. So one day he goes into a nearby town, he puts up his claim for sale, all of his equipment for sale. And another person buys him out, equipment, claim, and all. But this person went out and found a land surveyor and a geologist, and the three of them went out and looked for gold on the claim that they just bought. And they found the mother lode. And what surprised them most was that the person that they had bought it from had been digging within 3 feet of the mother lode. In other words, he stopped 3 feet short of finding his dream. He quit too soon. And maybe that's one thing we struggle with in life. All of us at one time or another will have to think about, is it time to end? Is it time to quit? Is it time to finish? Is it time to move on? Have I exhausted my opportunities and I'm just going to move on to the next part of my life because this just isn't working? We have to figure out a moment in time in our life when there are some things we just need to quit and not keep trying. It might be a business that seems to be struggling and we wonder, how long can we continue this business? What more do I have to do in order to make it successful? Or is it time to just cut our losses and move on to the next adventure, the next business, the next opportunity? People who have illnesses might have to make the decision, when is it that we stop having treatments because the treatments aren't accomplishing anything? When is it time to stop? Couples might have to ask the question, when is it time to stop trying to have a child because it's not working? Everything we've tried has failed. There is no hope. No matter how badly they want a child, it just isn't happening. Is it time to quit? In relationships, when is it time for a couple to file for divorce and separate? When is it not working? When is it appropriate and proper? When is it the time to give up and quit? Go their separate ways. And you can go through life and find all of these instances where we have to make decisions of whether we're going to keep on or whether we're just going to stop and not try anymore. But no matter what we decide, if we do decide to quit, there's always going to be these lingering questions. Well, what if I had hung in there for another month, that business would have turned around? What if we'd have tried one more time, we would have had that child? What if I would have tried that new treatment, it would have worked? What if? You see, the problem is we feel like we're quitters, and we've heard all that famous saying that said, winners never quit, and what? Quitters never win. There is something about not continuing on, giving up, not continuing to try that is within us, and it's hard not to do. I met a woman named Esther Coffin, who lived up in Minnesota. Esther was in her 80s. Her husband had died a couple years before I met her. But we were talking about her life, and she said that she'd been married over 50 years, but she remembered when she got married. She married a guy named George. They moved into a small farmhouse to start their life together. And in the very first week, they had this big argument. And Esther was so upset that she left the house and she ran to her mother's house where her mother was. She was thinking maybe she'd have to spend the night because she needed to reflect about maybe she made a mistake. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Maybe she should not go back. She went into her mother's house and she told her mother all the things that had happened and about the disagreement and about the argument. And before she could suggest to her mother, well, maybe I should spend the night so I can think about this, her mother said, well, Esther, it's time for you to go back home. You married George, and now you're going to have to figure it out. You see, for Esther's mother, quitting wasn't an option. Figuring it out was the option. Esther went back. She and George figured it out. And Esther said, that wasn't the only time we had to figure something out. There were many times we had to work at it, figure it out. But you see, at the end of their life together, it was worth it all. And she still missed George deeply. When do you give up? When do you stop? When do you continue on? It's one of those questions that we face in our own lives. And I think it is one of the questions that probably aggravated Abram and Sarai the most. Now I'm going to say up front, sometimes I will say Abram, sometimes I will say Abraham. Sometimes I'll say Sarai, sometimes I'll say Sarah. Because at the point of the story, they have not yet had their names changed. Yet we know them by Abraham and Sarah, not necessarily by Abram and Sarai. We don't talk about them. So even though the story is Sarai and Abram, I might be talking Abraham and Sarah, but please bear with me and know that who I'm talking about are the same people. But if you remember the story, 10 years earlier, Abram was visited by God, and God said, look, I'm going to send you off to a land which I will show you, and you will have descendants that will outnumber the stars. And you will be the father of many nations, and you will bless all nations through you. All you have to do is follow where I lead you. And the incredible story is Abram gets up, packs his bags, takes Sarai with her and his nephew Lot, and they head out following wherever it is that God's leading to them, not knowing where their destination is going to be, not knowing what lies in their future. All they have in front of them is the promise of God's covenant that he will be the father of many nations, and he will have a land to live in. And for 10 years they've been living as a nomad. For 10 years they have not had any children. And for Sarai to be barren, to not be able to bear children for her husband, she is missing out on her primary purpose as a wife and a mother. It is almost seen as a curse, because you remember in the text it says, the Lord has chosen not to let me have children. So any woman who did, and particularly wife who was not having children, was seen to be not looked upon with respect or was cursed by God. But she was not also looked on respect by people around her, because they were all wondering, what did this woman do that God would not let her have children? And for 10 years after Abram received this promise of a descendants that numbered the stars and would have a land and he'd be the father of many nations, you have to imagine that when Sarai heard that promise, she might have been very excited, because that meant she would have to have children. For that promise to be fulfilled, if Abraham to have descendants, she was going to have to be the mother. And they traveled in the countryside for 10 years, moving around as nomads, going from place to place and experiencing different things. And 10 years, and she still not had children. And every day that passed, and every year that passed, maybe Sarai thought about, my time of childbearing is running shorter. Why didn't I have one this year? Why not now? How long do I have to wait? And what if it doesn't happen before it's too late? Even though they had the promises of God, Sarai had to have wondered, had to have felt the deepening shame, the sadness, the disappointment as every year passed and there was not a child. It was at that point that Sarai decided to take things in her own hands. She had a slave girl named Hagar, an Egyptian. So she told Abram, look, I want you to take my slave girl. I'm going to give her to you as a wife, but I want you to have children with her, because if she has a child, then I can be its mother, and I can give you heirs to your name. Now, we know about these things happen even today. It's called surrogate mothers. Sarai basically says to Hagar, I want you to be the surrogate mother of my children. But we also know that these things get to be pretty complicated. The baby is born, and suddenly the couple is ecstatic about having a new child, but the only problem is this woman who has carried this baby for 9 months feels an attachment that she wasn't expecting. And at the last minute, she suddenly decides, maybe I don't want to give up my right as the parent's mom. Maybe I want to be the mother. I want to be in the child's life, and that wasn't in the agreement in the first place. And it creates all these kind of emotional impact and struggles, and things get complicated and difficult as they try to figure out who's the mom, who's the parents, what are they going to do to resolve this issue between them. Why would we think Sarai and Hagar would have anything different? Abraham takes Hagar as his wife. They have it. She conceives. She's going to have a baby. And as soon as she knows she's going to have a baby, suddenly something changes in the way she looks at Sarai, her master, her mistress. Because no longer, she has something that Sarai doesn't have. She has the child of her husband. She is giving Abraham what Sarai could not give. And even though she's a slave girl, I would imagine it kind of empowers her a little bit to look at Sarai and say, look, you can't do what you've been doing to me. I'm a little bit more than a slave now. I'm not who I once was. I might even have greater value to Abraham than you, because I will give him a child. Sarai sees something in the eyes of Hagar. That Hagar no longer sees Sarai as someone who is important to her. The Hebrew word is translated trifling. Something of insignificance, of no consequence. Suddenly, Sarai is not who Sarai was previously. And it angers Sarai. And Sarai starts blaming Abraham. She said, look, I gave you that girl. She has a baby. Now she treats me with contempt. And the division between her and Hagar deepens. But because Sarai is the master, she can do what she wants, and she treats Hagar harshly. Harshly enough to the point where Hagar runs away. She's headed back home. She can't deal with what is going on in her life. She can't deal with Sarai any longer, so she leaves, even at the risk of being chased down and captured and brought back. She doesn't care. She can't take it. Things have gotten so confusing, so complicated between Hagar and Sarai and the treatments and how it's going to be resolved. Hagar just leaves. She's at a spring out in the middle of the wilderness getting water. An angel of the Lord appears. It says to Hagar, Hagar, go back. Go back because you have this promise. Your son will have many descendants, be a leader of nations, a father of a nation that will have multitudes. He'll be powerful and blessed. You'll be independent and free. Go back. What does Hagar do? She could have said, no, I'm not going back. I'm in this kind of trouble. Because when she goes back, it's not going to be better. She's going to go back and she's going to face Sarai, who now is probably even more angry because she ran away and left her. Who knows how Abraham will react for her leaving and taking his son with? She's going to go back to more confusion, more struggle. And she'll go back with this promise from God. Go back, your son will be blessed. You'll be a leader of a nation. You'll have descendants in multitudes. Go back. It's interesting, in the Old Testament, it is Hagar, the Egyptian slave, who is the woman who gives God a name, El Roi. Because God sees Hagar in his trouble, and God comes to Hagar with a promise. It's interesting, out of the three characters, the one who hangs in there, even though she wants to quit, but goes back, and who follows the promises of God, is Hagar. Not Abraham. Because when Sarai suggested this plan in the first place, you didn't hear Abraham say to Sarai, "No, Sarai, we cannot do this because God has made a promise and God is faithful and God is just and God will give us a child. We just have to wait. We are not going to take this into our own hands. We are going to wait for God to do it in God's own time." Abraham never stood up for the promise. He just said, "Okay, Sarai, whatever you say." Sarai took it in her own hands, not trusting that God would one day give her a child, whenever that might be. She rather took things in her hands. So in a way, Abraham and Sarai quit on the promises of God and decided if they were going to have children, they'd do it their way, at their own time, in their own manner. And look where it got them. 15 years later, Isaac is born. And I wonder, after Isaac's been born and now Sarah and Abraham are sitting there maybe looking at their newborn son, they think back to the days of Hagar and Ishmael. I wonder if they thought, maybe we should have been more patient. Maybe we should have hung in there longer. Maybe we should have trusted God. Maybe we shouldn't taken all this matter into our own hands. And maybe they thought about it and reflected, how would have things been different if we had been faithful rather than doing it our way? Would we had to have gone through all of that? Would we had all of that struggle and confusion if we had just waited? Because what they eventually learned out is it may not have been when they wanted it, but it was that God was faithful to the promise and the covenant that God made with them. You can imagine them sitting there looking at their son, the heir to the covenant, saying, well, maybe God is trustworthy. Maybe God is faithful. Maybe they learned something from that experience. Because I think Abraham did. Because 12 years after that, God comes to Abraham one more time and says to Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son Isaac. You remember that story? As they're walking to the site where the sacrifice is to take place, and as Isaac is carrying the wood of the sacrifice on his back, he looks up to his father and he says, Father, where is the sacrifice? Abraham knows where the sacrifice is. Or maybe he doesn't, but what does Abraham say to him? He doesn't say, you're the sacrifice. All Abraham says is, God will provide the sacrifice. God will provide it. And Abraham is faithful to that promise that God will provide the sacrifice because God is always faithful. And maybe as they're walking along, Abraham's thinking about, you see, Isaac is the fulfillment of the covenant. If you take Isaac away, I have no covenant. What is God going to do with that? How is God going to fix this if he wants me to sacrifice Isaac, and Isaac is the one through whom the covenant is to be fulfilled? How is that going to all work out? But Abraham remembers the covenant. Abraham remembers that God is faithful, and through this whole ordeal, Abraham will remain faithful to God, that God will provide the sacrifice. God will work this out. God has made a promise. God will do it. And Abraham was faithful even to the point of lifting the knife above Abraham to sacrifice, or Isaac to sacrifice him. Abraham learned to remain in there and not quit on the promises of God. Because at that moment the sacrifice was provided and a ram was found stuck in a tree right next to them. The sacrifice was provided, just as Abraham believed. And maybe that's one of the hard questions that we face nowadays. Can hardly go through this last week and not feel some sort of emotional disappointment or distress or depression or whatever you want to call it, anger, frustration. As the police are killed and African American men are killed and everybody's dying and there's going to be funerals and there's protests and snipers and anger. Division seems to be deepening and we're wondering what is going on in our world. You hear about the bombing in Istanbul, the bombings in Pakistan, you hear bombings in Baghdad, you hear about all of this stuff going on and you keep wondering, where are you, God? When are you going to bring peace like you promised? We can't help but wonder, God, don't you care what's going on around here? Can't you make changes so that all of this stuff doesn't have to happen anymore? It can make us want to give up on God. Try to do things on our own, relying on our own humanity to fix the world's problems. Or maybe believe that God really doesn't care, or there is a God. Or maybe we end up wondering, why aren't you acting? You have the ability and the power to change things. Can't you do this for us? If you're wondering about whether people aren't asking that question, then you may need to know that the largest growing section of religious faith in the United States are the nuns. They have no religious affiliation at all, and it's the fastest growing segment of our population. Because people are asking. People are wondering. And it's not just those who don't believe. If we're all honest, we all think about it at times as we look at the headlines and the news. And you know what it is? It's tempting to say, I give up. I quit. I don't worry about the promises that God has made any longer. We're not seeing them, are we? But you see, that's the point of the story of Hagar and Sarai and Abram. Don't quit on God. Because God will fulfill the promises of grace. God will fulfill the promises of peace. God will fulfill the promises of mercy and grace. God will fulfill the promises of the kingdom that is to come. God will fulfill the promises that He has made through Jesus Christ. There's not a promise that God has made that God will not fulfill. It's just that God does it at His time and not ours. It's Kairos time, not Chronos time, God's time. Warren Wiersbe points out that God has always made us wait. He made Abraham wait 25 years. He made Isaac and Rebekah wait for 20 years before they had their first child. He made Jacob wait 14 years to marry the love of his life, and then 6 more years before he could be independent. He made him wait 20 years. The prophets have waited. The disciples have waited. We wait. That doesn't mean that God is not going to fulfill the promises He's made. Because those promises are the only hope we have. And like Hagar, we have to believe and not quit. There's one more part. God delivers a promise to Hagar that her son is going to be blessed and that he will have this nation. He gives a promise that inspires Hagar to believe. But then God sends Hagar back to where she came. You come here to hear those promises. You come here to have your faith renewed. You come here to be reminded that we are not to give up on God no matter what it looks like out in the world. God has bigger and better things in store for us as His people. But it'll happen when God wants it to happen. Until then, we are called to believe, to hang in there, to not quit. And we're also sent to go back. To go back out into the world. to remind people of those promises, to say, hang in there. It's going to get better because it is what God wants for us. That God is the God of love and grace, and God's kingdom will come. And things will be done here on earth as they are in heaven. And Jesus will come. And evil will be defeated. Sin will be defeated. Death will be defeated. That banquet that we celebrate monthly at the table will be real. It's going to happen. It's coming. Don't quit. Don't give up. Keep believing in the God of us. Yeah, it's complicated. It's hard. Believe. And don't give